Hey everyone, today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast is another one of our two-part episode series here where in this particular episode, Paul Schnackenberg and I are going to break down the Cyber Safety Review Board's findings of the Microsoft Storm-0558 breach that happened last year. So we hit record and we just started talking, and lo and behold, we went for about an hour on this particular subject. So we've broken it up into two parts, what the finding means, what we got right, what we think should be different, and lots more on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got a very familiar face on the show. I got Paul Schnackenberg back. How's it going, Paul?
I am good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. And, you know, I think you've been on the show so much lately because whenever there is some Microsoft security issue to talk about, you're kind of my guy, right? And there's been a lot lately.
There's been a lot of them. This is part of the three-part. Let's I was going to say bag Microsoft, but let's show Microsoft up for the issues that they have series, and this is the third and hopefully final episode in that series.
Hopefully, right? And yeah, that's a good point. I want to preface this with people that know me, and hopefully people that listen to the show, they know that Microsoft products are near and dear to me. I really like Microsoft products, and I know sometimes it sounds like we're bagging on them, but I just want them to do better, you know? Because they're so ingrained in digital ecosystems all over the planet. There's so much that relies on them. We need them to do better, right? Because of that's
really what it comes down to, and I think that's so important to underline here. Like, I'm a Microsoft partner. I resell Microsoft's products. I've been using Microsoft's technologies for close to 30 years by this stage, right? Like it is absolutely. And I have chosen not to use other technologies at times when it's come up, right? And I can wax lyrically about a lot of very good Microsoft products that I really enjoy and that help my clients be more secure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, there is definitely a point here to be made that Microsoft needs to do better in this one area. And it is glaringly obvious to everyone, and I just hope it's glaringly obvious to Microsoft as well. And that's what we're here to talk about today.
I would hope so. And I mean, if you asked me 5 years ago, is there a chance that Microsoft would ever let the security goodwill of Azure, M365, of their cloud services ever be compromised in any way? I would have said no way, because that whole ecosystem is built on the concept of trust. You take the trust away, now it's more difficult for people to make that choice to adopt it. And here we are, right? So
yeah, here we are.
Yep. And I guess before we get much further, just so we get everybody on the same baseline here, of course, what we're talking about is the Storm-0558 breach of Microsoft cloud systems. So this is the deal where a Chinese nation-state threat actor, through a series of security incidents at Microsoft, they were able to procure, what did we say in the previous episode, Paul? They purloined a consumer signing key. That's right, a consumer signing key. And they were then able to use that key to essentially forge their own authentication tokens into Microsoft Cloud services. Now, we found out later on, after more news came out, that the threat actor then used these tokens to siphon information out of the U.S. State Department, especially where, I forget how they explain it, like Pan-Asian diplomatic relations are concerned, right? Is essentially what the target was. And there were a number of other organizations that were impacted as part of this as well. But that's, in a nutshell, the incident that has prompted this review by the Cyber Safety Review Board, which I believe they are under CISA's umbrella, if I remember correctly. So they've released this report, and I'll put a link to the full report in the show notes. Essentially, what we're talking about today is the findings of this report. And when I downloaded this and I started reading it, I'm like, "Ooh, buckle up! This is gonna be a doozy." And I guess for this episode, Paul, normally we come into these episodes and we have kind of a roughly defined structure for our conversation, right? And this report is so large, I could see this becoming a two-parter. So, folks, if this turns into a part 1, part 2, next week's episode will be a continuation of this. So that's optional at this point. We'll see how long this conversation goes. But anyway, I figure what we do is we would just start at the top of the report and we kind of go through and I think call out the important bits and provide our commentary. So what do you think, Paul? Should we get started with their Well, I guess absolutely. Their first big gut punch here.
Well, there's two things I want to point out first. This is 34 pages, I think, or something like that. So it's not a super heavy read. We will obviously link to it in the show notes. So I think this is required reading for anybody who's a Microsoft customer or who works in security, basically. The second thing we should point out is that we will be talking about Microsoft again, and we did talk about how we like their products. I also want to point out to anyone who's not sort of necessarily super heavily into tech or security that I, as a consultant, and most other people that I know that are in this space, even though these things are happening, are still recommending cloud over on-premises infrastructure. Yes. So this is not an excuse to say, oh, well, we got an Exchange server on-premises, so we're good. We're not going to move to the cloud, right? That is not the takeaway from this report. There's a lot of other good takeaways from this report, but that is not what I'm seeing here. So,
and I'm glad you brought that up, Paul, because it's funny. Eric Siren, another guest of the show, he and I have talked about this exact thing before. I don't remember what episode it was. I'll put the episode in the show notes, but we had an episode where we talked about premises security versus cloud security, and that was the same conclusion we came to as well. Because it would require astronomical amounts of investment to make your on-premises data center as secure as cloud ecosystems. And I jokingly call Eric a prophet because he made the prediction. This is before a lot of these big security incidents came to light. He made the prediction that, if you look, at Azure, for example, from an infrastructure perspective, it's not going to be attacked at the infrastructure level. They are going to attack the identity mechanisms. And, that's what happened, right?
That's what happened. That's absolutely what happened. And also, before we head into the report, I also do want to point out, in case somebody doesn't know, so this is the third report from the Cyber Safety Review Board, and they are sort of modeled a little bit on the air, I've forgotten what the acronym for it is, but the one who investigates when there is an airline crash of some kind, right? They come in and the investigator figure out what went wrong, and they recommend steps so that it never happens again. Although they have a lot more teeth than the CSRB has today. But the second thing is, this is not government employees. The people who are on this board are security experts, luminaries from the industry. They're very well respected. So this isn't a set of government employees coming up with some sort of recommendation. This is literally the top of the security experts sitting down and figuring this out. And I do want to point out they have very strict rules around not being involved in the companies that you're investigating. So in this case, for example, I know at least one of them didn't participate in this report because she has ties to Microsoft. So obviously there's a conflict of interest there. So that's what this is. And that's why it carries so much weight in the industry, because when these guys talk, you listen, basically. So
right. Exactly. So looking at this report, Paul, like I said, we'll kind of start at the top and we'll kind of go top to bottom and talk through all the highlights. But I think the big major key points that I want to highlight here, and the CSRB did not pull any punches on this. I think it's on, page 2 or 3? I don't remember which one. Basically says, and I quote, "They found this intrusion was preventable and should never have occurred. The board also concludes that Microsoft's security culture was inadequate and requires an overhaul.
Yep.
And that is like one of the very first findings that they come up with. And I mean, agree. I completely agree with that.
We've said in the previous episodes as well, as we follow this saga and as more and more information has come out, this is exactly what we've said as well, and this is what we want to see, and that's why a lot of people, including this report, calls back to the trustworthy computing memo from 2002 or 2001, Bill Gates, right, which is over 20 years ago now, where they really did make a huge change. So yeah, they should.
They should, definitely. And we talked about the Secure Future Initiative in a previous episode quite a bit. And it's interesting. In that episode, we kind of compared and contrast, the Secure Computing Memo with the Secure Future Initiative. And the Secure Future Initiative was announced back in November, if I remember correctly, at Microsoft Ignite. I haven't really heard anything about it ever since then. Have you? Well,
the one thing I hear is when there now are breaches or security incidents, and we're going to talk about a recent one, Microsoft sort of uses SFI as a reference. They say, based on our SFI, this is what we're going to do. Outside of Microsoft, I haven't seen much. Now, I mean, there could be all sorts of things going on inside of Microsoft that we're not seeing. Obviously, right? We're not. There's over 110,000 people or something working at Microsoft. We're not hanging over every person's shoulder. We have no idea sort of how much the culture is changing. But based on the evidence we have from the outside, we're not seeing the change yet that really needs to be there, no matter how much they talk about SFI. And I think the main point to make here is that back 20 years ago, Microsoft saw the security flaws that they had built into their products through being lax, basically, as an existential threat. They literally saw that if we don't fix this, we're not going to be able to keep selling our products because people won't buy them. Right or wrong, right? Now, I don't think that's the case. And I think the big difference is that Microsoft is now probably the world's largest security product manufacturer. And they weren't back then. I mean, think back then. I mean, you had XP. You bought your third-party antivirus. You bought your third-party security products. Yeah, Microsoft had a little firewall in there and whatever, but there wasn't even Windows Defender. There wasn't even built-in antivirus. All of that was third-party. Microsoft left all that to third parties. Now, they have their own set of products, and I think that's the change that has happened here. They don't probably see it as existential, or it doesn't look to us from the outside based on the evidence we have that they see this as existential, because they're going, well, we'll just fix up our security products and it'll be good. We'll cover it up. Which I don't think is true.
And I think this kind of... Sorry, go ahead.
Which I don't think is true. That was all.
Right. And this comes back to another thing that you and I have talked about in the past, and that is, I feel like Microsoft has created all these different security products, and it has become a profit center for them now. Their security products, right? And so I don't remember if it was this report or if I read somewhere else where, somebody was saying that the recommendation should be like, okay, security is one of those things that maybe we should think about it not being a profit center because it's so important. But I think that's a valid question, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a big challenge, and obviously there's the argument and the counter argument. The argument is, well, if Microsoft fixes the underlying flaw, then you don't need the security product on top. But the other argument is that, well, every other third-party security product that builds on top of, they charge for this feature. Are you saying Microsoft should? So like it's a gray area, but. As I mentioned once upon a time, which I stole from somebody else on a podcast, that it's a bit like the arsonist also being the fire department, right? Like they really are doing both, and it gets a bit messy ethically.
It does, and maybe that's why the argument feels valid, at least, right? Because it's like, Yeah, I like that that metaphor, the arsonist, the one you just used. The other one I've heard is like, okay, the factory owner is also the factory inspector, right? Um, that's just that conflict of interest. Anyway, so coming back to the report, couple other very interesting points here in the initial sections of the report. There's one I'm going to skip over here about other cloud service providers, but we're going to come back to that. But the other thing I want to point out here is that, and I'm going to quote here, and it is talking about transparency, because you and I, Paul, have talked quite frequently in these episodes about the need for transparency from these major cloud vendors. And here it talks about, Microsoft acknowledged to the board in November 2023, and I'm quoting here, that its September 6, 2023 blog post about the root cause was inaccurate. It did not update that post until March 12th, as the board was concluding its review, and only after the board's repeated questioning about Microsoft's plan to issue a correction. Now, later on in this report, they go on to say that, okay, companies that caught wind of this Storm-0558 situation, which I imagine that's, most companies that care, right? They could not make accurate risk assessments because they didn't have the real story, right? They didn't have all the pieces of the pie to make an informed risk assessment.
That is exactly it. And the core of that argument is simply this. Microsoft, in that blog post, and when we talked about this on the last episode in this series, when you and I talked about this, we assumed that what Microsoft wrote in that post about how that key got out from the production environment onto a crash dump, then onto an engineer's laptop, then onto the corporate network, then got owned from there. We assumed the way Microsoft wrote it, that that's what happened, that they had identified those steps. The truth is, which they only updated in that blog post on March the 12th, they don't know. They actually don't know. They think this is the most likely scenario, but they don't have the logging. They don't have the information to prove how that key actually got into the hands of the Russians. And that is, that's
unsettling.
Not ideal.
Disconcerting. I could come up with all kinds of words for that.
Disconcerting.
I mean, I've been in security long enough now to I just gave a talk at PowerShell Summit on the secure handling of secrets in automated processes, and one of the things I said was, I don't trust private networks anymore. Right? Because we've just been taught to assume breach. So when I hear things like, hey, we lost control of this consumer signing key, we don't know how it was exfiltrated. Now my brain is thinking like, okay, if they don't know how it was exfiltrated, is there still a back door somewhere? Is there still persistence in that environment for the threat actor? I start asking questions like that. This is conjecture. Right. I don't know this as fact, but it's just conjecture and questions that come up when I hear they don't know how the key was exfiltrated. Right.
Well, I suppose that's one of the big things here, that they don't actually know that, and that they didn't say that. Right. Because that then means that people are making, and obviously, there's lawyers involved here. Obviously, there are lawyers who say what's going to go into these blog posts and not. Because when you ask the many very smart, very capable, very honest and ethical security people at Microsoft, they would have written probably a very different blog post, I think. You know
I'm
what
sure
I mean?
they would.
But it's the lawyers that, like, we can't admit that we did something wrong because then we'll end up in trouble. And I think that's one of the problems. And that's why I'm hoping that the CSRB gets a bit more teeth in the future. Because one of the things that happens with airline crashes is they are not held responsible, right? Like, there's legal framework in place so that when something happens, they can be completely honest. This is what happened. This is what we did. This is what we didn't do. This is what led to this, and this. Because they know that they're not going to be hung out to dry for it. This is not the same case in cybersecurity. So,
right, it's just It's just an interesting turn of events there.
Mm.
So they also go on here to talk about in this report, and I'm going to quote another section here.
Mm-hmm.
How Microsoft's ubiquitous and critical products, which underpin essential services that support national security, the foundations of our economy, and public health and safety, require the company to demonstrate the highest standards of security, accountability, and transparency.
Yep.
Unquote. And this goes along with something that was mentioned elsewhere in the report, in that they almost make this admission that, and because it's the CSRB, it's associated with the U.S. federal government, that they've almost made this admission that public cloud is deemed as critical infrastructure now,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, at least as far as the U.S. goes.
Yep.
Which folks on the show, correct me if I'm, listeners listening, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy at hornetsecurity.com. But I personally have not heard that admission or that claim anywhere that I'm aware of. Have you, Paul?
No, I haven't. And I think this is part of the changing perception of our society, right? You ask anybody on the street what's critical infrastructure, they'll think about, water treatment and electricity grid and those sorts of things, right? But when you're talking about this side of the coin, because everything is now so digitalized in our society, those electricity grids don't work when the computers are down. Those water treatment plants or whatever it is don't work when the computers are down, right? And I think that's a huge shift, and that's what we really need to think about. I'm going to do the next quote.
Sure.
Microsoft's customer would benefit from its CEO and board of directors directly focusing on the company's security culture and developing and sharing publicly a plan with specific timelines to make fundamental security-focused reforms across the company and its full suite of products. End quote. And I'll add one more bit here before we comment. Deprioritize feature developments across the company's cloud infrastructure and product suite until substantial security improvements have been made in order to preclude competition for resources. In all instances, security risks should be fully and appropriately assessed and addressed before new features are deployed. End quote.
Yep. That's a big one. And that ties in with one of the last episodes you and I did, and that was around, is the this brash drive for innovation at all costs, is it accelerating security threats? And it seems the CSRB here is agreeing with, yes, it is accelerating security threats, right?
Absolutely.
Innovation at all costs.
Yeah, we called it. And I think this is what happened 20 years ago. Bill Gates said, if we develop a new feature and it's not secure, we're not going to release it. When we start developing this feature, we've got to do security first. And here's what I'm going to say. I'm not a developer, and I'm outside of Microsoft, never worked for Microsoft. But here's what I'm going to say. I think that 20 years ago, they adopted the secure development lifecycle. And the whole company got a jolt and a wake-up call to develop secure code. I think they had thought, up until maybe 12 months ago or so, that this was a solved problem, that they had this in hand, right? We have the SDL, we do security reviews, we do all of this, right? It's just that what they did 20 years ago was really, really good then, and lots of company, cough Adobe, cough Oracle, could have learned from that back then, but the industry has changed and cloud has changed so much. And I think Microsoft needs another jolt like that. And I think this report is it, if you really read it, to go, oh, we did those changes back then. They were good, but we need to do a whole new set of changes now, according to those quotes. And I think those quotes are bang on. That's what needs to happen.
For sure.
Not secure future initiative. I think that's what needs to happen.
Exactly. And I skipped over one of our highlighted points here earlier. I want to go back to it now. Mm-hmm. So with those quotes in mind about how, hey, new features should be held off on until, security is in order, going back to bullet point 3 and the first couple of pages here of the CSRB's report, and I quote, "Other cloud service providers which maintain security controls that Microsoft did not." So they call out, quote, "other cloud service providers" in this article quite a few times. And I have to imagine that's AWS, Google Compute, right? Oracle Cloud, whoever.
They actually,
and so it sounds like,
they actually named them specifically later on in the report.
Oh, did they?
They did actually talk to those guys. Anyway, keep going.
And so my point here is like, Microsoft, I think, has been so laser focused, so tunnel vision on AI recently, and been so has been pushing innovation so hard that it sounds like that they have not implemented all the security controls that some of the other major players in the space sounds like they have put in place, right?
And this is really interesting for us to learn. So one of those is that Google Compute Cloud has a database of every cred they have ever issued. So when you see a cred, right, like the thing that Storm-0558 minted, they could have checked in their database and say, oh, we didn't issue this one, so it's not valid.
Yep.
Microsoft did not have that sort of technology in place. On the AWS side, and I'm not an AWS expert by any stretch of the imagination, they have a unique authentication key for each user or role, which cannot be used as a token. Whereas in Microsoft's case, the authorization system accepted a token that it had not issued. It just accepted it, even though it shouldn't have. And before I forget, I do want to tie in one of the things they do point out in the report related to these tokens is that Microsoft was in the process of shifting away from this one system of authentication in both the consumer and try the commercial being tied together. But they didn't enforce that separation of checking which key came from which environment in their SDKs. Now, they've obviously fixed that now, but that was a major... To assume that the developers in-house and outside of Microsoft would automatically implement that because they put it in the documentation that, hey, you need to check which environment this key came from so that you use it in the right environment. Putting that back on the developers is really silly. Frankly, I think that's really silly.
Yeah.
They should have gone, hey, we can't do this until we fix the SDK so that this happens automatically for every single authentication. Yeah. Don't assume that the developers read every page of documentation.
I've talked to some developers and wait, why can't I put, credentials in clear text? What's wrong with that? Nobody's ever going to look at those files, which more on that later.
Yeah, exactly.
More on that later. Anyway, so scrolling down through the report a little bit more, they've got another section here where they call out some additional items based on lessons learned from this report and its fact-finding into prevailing security practices across the cloud. The board, and they start kind of making a couple of recommendations here. And there's two in this section that we want to call out specifically. And the first one is something we've talked about before, Paul, and that is audit logging norms.
Yep.
And so... then again, quoting the report, cloud service providers should adopt a minimum standard for default audit logging in cloud services to enable the detection, prevention, and investigation of intrusions as a baseline and routine service offering without additional charge, unquote.
Yep.
Totally agree. There should be a set of standards.
Completely agree.
That this is how we do audit logging in the cloud. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
No, that's absolutely right. I completely agree with you as well and with the report. The interesting thing, so we got to learn a bit of the background here. So many of the government organizations who were targeted, and there was a total of 22 organizations, 503 users were targeted, and there were only 391 of those in the US. There were a bunch of people in the UK and a few other places as well. so logging for everything should be included in the base cost and should be retained long enough. But the State Department did have the G5, so the equivalent of E5, Microsoft 365 E5 logging. But the reason they spotted this is because they built their own analysis engine on top of that logging. Because the thing that triggered them was mail items accessed. That's a single event log entry. Now, that happens, as you can imagine, right? Every time somebody accesses something in their mailbox. That's obviously going to generate an enormous amount of logs, right? So they built this big yellow taxi on top of this. And that's how they could detect that, hey, people are accessing these emails in these mailboxes, and it's an anomalous access. And at the time when they started investigating, they assumed that those users have been compromised, right? That there was a bad guy who'd gotten hold of their cred somehow and was accessing those mail items. And eventually they started digging through it and getting to the bottom of it. And the other interesting thing about that is that Microsoft didn't find this thing. If the State Department didn't have big yellow taxi, we might not know about this breach, and it might still have been ongoing today, right? Because it wasn't Microsoft that spotted this, it was one of their customers.
Right. And it's crazy to think of how much worse the breach could have been if that was the case. But yeah, I think it comes back to the initial point. There should be a set standard of logging mechanisms in the cloud. And I think that's one of the best takeaways from this report. And to your point earlier, I hope the CSRB eventually can be given the teeth to enforce these things. Yeah. And there's a section in the report where they talk about, okay, we're going to, I think actually think it's one of the recommendations, meet on the regular with all the major cloud service providers to work on standards and processes and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. And which I think would be absolutely great for the industry.
I think so too.
Hey everyone, this is just a quick reminder that this is a two-part series. So again, Paul and I have been talking about the Cyber Safety Review Board's findings of the Storm-0558 breach. We've been talking for about a half an hour, and next week will be the continuation of that in part 2. So stay tuned, and we hope to see you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast.